Let's resume our study of the Wilderness Tabernacle by reviewing some of the features we've seen and then proceeding to explore the sin and guilt offerings. Always we want to keep before us God's express objective so that the people may enjoy His presence and that He could be in close proximity with them. That was the purpose of the establishment of the tabernacle, its furnishings, its building. We've appreciated the fact that as a worshiper or a member of the priestly group would approach from the outside, they would encounter this tall fencing and so would be inspired to remember they are about to enjoy God's undivided attention and hopefully would be similarly inspired to reciprocate by giving their undivided attention. Do we do the same as we think about meeting with God? The laver or basin may have inspired them to realize that God was extending an opportunity for refreshing, and also they, on their part, were submitting to the need for cleansing. And then at the altar of burnt offering, we saw several sentiments that God was training Israel to express to Him. In the first instance, again arising from Leviticus chapter 1, through the whole burnt offering, God was teaching the people to say routinely, morning and evening, I am entirely yours, God. As a nation, and why not embrace this message individually too? I am entirely yours, God, at the outset of the day and as the day draws to a close. As we do so, will we not hear Him affirm His welcome of us and perhaps remind us that so high a requirement of association with Him as complete surrender is something that in His divine fashion He has already done toward us, a staggering extension of His commitment to love us, never better epitomized than as we view the cross. The second of the 5 offerings and sacrifices from Leviticus, the mincha or grain offering, can be a reminder to us as to the ancient Israelites to circle back to God upon receipt of routine blessings such as health or employment or food, and respond to God in view of this by thanking Him for His generous provision of basic needs. Through the peace or fellowship offering, we find God training Israel and so training us in the discipline of gratitude of a more specific sort, so that arising from petitions, God help me in this instance with a health issue, with an employment issue, with a relational issue. Help me. And when He does help, then again to circle back with gratitude like the one of the 10 lepers. Interrupting his transit to the temple to present himself to the priest, he circled back to thank Jesus for the healing. And we find Jesus asking, where are the other 9? Do they not have this circle back discipline of gratitude built into them? God looks for this as a sign of a mature and growing relationship with Him. Those 3 wrap up the sacrifices or offerings that are savory, that have sweet aroma. I called them earlier good news. Initially, the whole burnt offering where we say, God, we're yours entirely. The grain offering where we may be reminded to say to God for the routine gifts of health, of income, thank you, of supportive family relationships. Thank you for that. Perhaps you live in a country where there is much safety and freedom without having to work too hard to get it. That's something to be grateful for. The third, by way of review, was the peace or fellowship offering, a reminder that when we come to God with particular needs and He answers, how important it is for us in a healthy relationship to come back with sincere gratitude to Him. The remaining 2 are sacrifices for removing sin. The sin offering found primarily in Leviticus 4 and the guilt offering in Leviticus 5. The sin offering is known as the chatat, a word that reminds us in Hebrew of the word for sin. So there's a very clear correlation between the Hebrew name and the English translation in this case.
The process is as follows. The offerer, you or I, would place our hand on the head of an animal. It would be a bull or a goat. And then certain portions would be burned on the altar. Other portions of the animal would be burned outside the camp. Fat burned on the altar, flesh, hide, and the remainder burned outside the camp. As we offer this to the priest, it's stipulated that we need to acknowledge what has gone wrong. Where has our relationship with God broken down? What have we done that constituted a sin? We need to say it. It reminds me of one branch of the Christian church. The Catholic Church is one that invites people to acknowledge out loud to another member of the community, to a priest, where has my relationship broken down? There's some health in that. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is mandatory and that in every case we should go to another person. Sometimes it's important to do that. You'd have to use our own discretion when that's important. But at the very least, and here's the principle for us all, it does no good to simply say, "Oh God, if somehow I have offended you today, please forgive me." That simply doesn't cut it. What must happen is that in our conversation with God, private though it may be, we need to acknowledge where it is that we've discovered things have broken down. Name it and acknowledge it. And that's the pattern that's laid down. It's still important today. The sin offering could be as great as an animal, as indicated, a bull or a goat, or if we do not have the financial resources for something so substantial, God said it's acceptable to give simply a certain unit of flour, a beautiful expression of grace, so that even the poor would find a place where they could get right with God. Some of the directions in chapter 4 Leviticus make a distinction along these lines. If the person who is confessing sin is the priest, that is, if the priest has done something wrong, has sinned. And similarly, in the situation where the entire community has trespassed, if the sin is of that magnitude, the spiritual leader or everyone in the community, then certain steps need to be taken. If it's a leader or a commoner, then the steps are not quite as involved. And primarily the difference is this. For the priest or community-wide sin, some of the blood of the offering, the sacrifice, must be brought in and sprinkled at the golden altar inside the tabernacle structure proper. In the case of leader or commoner, the process is entirely outside, out in the courtyard of the bronze altar. This is a reminder that particularly people who are in spiritual leadership must be very careful and realize the responsibility that we carry if we're representing others before God. What was the meaning that was conveyed through this? Well, here it's fairly clear. By offering a sin offering, I am saying to God with a contrite heart, I am sorry for what I have done. I regret it. I wish I had not done it. I am wrong. Another element of the meaning, as I understand it, is a substitution. The life of a pure animal given in place of the petitioner, in place of our life. That animal is forfeited, and if it were not for the animal, we would be forfeiting our life. In chapter 17 of Leviticus, verse 7, there's a comment about how God wanted the people to understand the function of blood. Perhaps as you're looking over these sacrifices, you're impressed with how much blood must have been poured out, and indeed it was, frankly, a messy process. Anytime animals are butchered, that's inevitable. But there's more to it than simply a slaughterhouse or a sense of butchery. There's a symbol going on here, and God says in Leviticus 17:11, I have given it, and that is referring to the blood, I've given it to you to make atonement. Let me tell you what I think is going on here. Others may differ with this, but my understanding, in the case of the slaying of an animal, the blood is released. It is a tangible indication that death has taken place. The pouring out, the loss of blood in those dimensions indicates that the animal has died. God says He's given the blood to make atonement. I think there's a sense in which the loss of blood is verifying that the necessary slaying, the death, has taken place. As a result of this offering, persons walking through this process would enjoy the result of atonement, a restored relationship with God, forgiveness coming as a result of it. You can see in the outline, I'm suggesting that this may particularly apply to intangible sin, sins of attitude, perhaps. The reason for that is that when we come to the final offering, which is the guilt offering, there's a particular component which suggests that the guilt offering can be measured in a monetary way, tangible gifts. So by inference, perhaps the sin offering may have applied more particularly to sins of attitude. I hesitate to say that's an exclusive or a watertight definition, but that seems to help us distinguish between these two types of sacrifices, both of which were aimed at solving a sin problem.
We can summarize the meaning of the sin offering by seeing here God's instruction that when we become convicted of events or attitudes in our life that have interfered with our relationship with God, we would acknowledge our guilt, acknowledge that sin, come with sorrow for having broken that relationship with God. And as we saw, the sin offering perhaps would incline us to pay attention to intangible sins, sins of thought, sins of word, sins of attitude, to take these seriously and ask for God's forgiveness, which He has promised through the finished work of Jesus Christ, God's ultimate sacrifice on the cross. Leviticus also teaches us that upon making our way to God with contrition and trusting in the finished work of His sacrifice to remove the pain and remove the stain of our sin, we find God assuring us that that in fact has happened. We do not need to walk with a sense of doubt or fear of lingering guilt. It's gone. Leviticus makes that proclamation through the priests. If people walk this path of reconciliation with God through the sin offering, also through the guilt offering, then the sin is removed. In Jesus Christ, our sin is removed.
The last offering then, which is the second in the collection for repairing the sin problem, expiatory, is known as the guilt offering. It comes from a Hebrew word asham, which itself does mean guilt, so there's a clear identity between the Hebrew and the English translation in this case. The process involves a ram, particularly this animal, a ram. In addition to giving a ram, it's stipulated that 20% surcharge, we might consider it, is assessed on top of whatever went wrong. So, for example, if I stole from you something worth $100, I would need to repay the $100, but then I would need to give to the temple, to the tabernacle, an additional 20%, $20 more would be given, which suggests that this particular offering, the guilt offering, somehow may have been associated with tangible offenses. As with the previous one, the priest may use some of this for food. And scholars suggest that this seems to have been a subset of the sin offering. The sin offering would solve for most every sort of offense, but this one was a subset of that, a specialized sort, the guilt offering. If we look to chapter 6 of Leviticus, we find there some particulars that would call for a guilt offering: robbery, fraud, a violating of a deposit, money deposit or some other tangible deposit are examples that are found there. The meaning is similar to the burnt offering, similar to the sin offering, substitutionary atonement, the animal taking the place of the guilty person, you or I, and as a result we go free and are forgiven. With it we're expressing how sorry we are, and we're paying back the penalty along with a little extra, as if to perhaps motivate us to not repeat that offense in the future. Forgiveness and atonement, then, is the result. And one of the beautiful truths that's repeated in these last two offerings, the priest is to make it very clear to the person making the offering, you are forgiven as a result of this. Perhaps you've met someone who may have been offered the opportunity through Christ's sacrifice to have a restored relationship with God, and perhaps they've responded, I don't think that God can forgive me. I have a hunch there were people back in the Old Testament era who had that same misconception, and the priests were instructed graciously to express to them, you will be forgiven. Perhaps you've entertained those thoughts as well. I wonder if that particularly heinous sin is something that God will really forgive. I invite you to listen to the words that are there. Perhaps you want to take a look in Leviticus 4 or 5. We won't stop to find those particular ones, but you can find them in Leviticus 4 or 5, places where the priest is to say, you are forgiven. And know that as we invoke the sacrifice of Christ, who fulfilled these offerings, as we invoke his sacrifice, put our trust in his perfect offering, God's forgiveness is entirely ours. In fact, it would disappoint God if we thought that somehow our crime, our sin, was too big for the cross. That's an attitude of pride, which itself is something that needs forgiveness. No, the cross covers it. And that's the good news that we're reminded of in these patterns set up in the Hebrew Bible.
The guilt offering can be summarized in this way. Perhaps it was in the guilt offering that God was teaching people to have a means of acknowledging wrongdoing when that involved tangible wrongdoing, tangible material trespass. Similar to the sin offering, acknowledging it, realizing that in God's perfect sacrifice, which we now in a New Testament era recognize as operating and being fulfilled through the death of Christ on our behalf on the cross. Consequent to that, then, we can hear God say, just in the same degree of reverberating assurance as he would say through the priests of old, your guilt is removed. It's gone. These are the kind of assurances that we find in John's first letter. If we confess our sins, he, God, is faithful and can be counted on to forgive us our sin, to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. It's done. It's finished. You are free.
After a priest was involved serving in this way, he would go back to the laver, to the basin, wash hands and feet, and then, if it was his duty, if he was on the roster call to serve in the tabernacle proper, perhaps arranging bread on the table or providing the olive oil for the lamp or incense for the golden altar, he would then be qualified to move in and serve in that area. The next episode of this lecture will concentrate on the tabernacle structure proper.